We are on session 20 today. So these are the ones we finished. Last week we did session 2, which we did part 2 of chapter 1, which is session 19. And then 2 weeks ago, we did session 18, which was the first part of chapter 1. So today we're going to do the third part of chapter 1. We're going to talk about Arjuna seeing the armies, decision not to fight, duty, love, freedom, and happiness. These are all various important things. So this is our view here. This is chapter 1, part 3, session 20. And we're going to go from verses 20 to 27 in the first chapter. Arjuna sees the armies, decision not to fight, duty, love, freedom, and happiness. So this is our agenda for today. We're in part 3 of chapter 1. And here are our verses. Let me get some water here before I roll into them. So this is session 20 of Gita from Zero. And we're in the first chapter, and from verse 20 to 27, this is how the verses read in chapter 1 of Bhagavad-gītā. 20. At that time, can you all see that? Is that pretty legible from where you are?
Yeah, that's good.
At that time, Arjuna, the son of Pandu, seated in the chariot bearing the flag marked with Hanuman, took up his bow and prepared to shoot his arrows. O king, after looking at the sons of Dhritarashtra, drawn in military array, Arjuna then spoke to Lord Krishna these words. So we've read about Sanjaya talking to Dhritarashtra. Then we heard about Duryodhana examining and commenting on the Pandava army first, then his own army. Then after that, we heard about the blowing of the conch shells. And now, this is right after the blowing of the conch shells. So 20 to 21, Arjuna said, O infallible one, please draw my chariot between the two armies so that I may see those present here who desire to fight and with whom I must contend in this great trial of arms. So as we know, the battle of Kurukshetra has not begun. Rather, both armies are poised, staring at each other, and the battle is about to start. So Arjuna and Krishna are at the front of their army, the Pandava army, and now, after the conch shells are blown, Arjuna is asking Krishna to pull the chariot between the two armies. So, we saw the whole scene here. You've got Arjuna and Krishna on the chariot. There's one army, there's the other army. And now Krishna's about to roll the chariot between the two armies so they can get a good look. So here's 24. Sanjaya said, remember this is Sanjaya relating what's going on in the battlefield, which is miles away. He's relating it as if he's watching it on television within his mind. And he's telling Dhritarashtra blow by blow what's happening. And he's saying, O descendant of Bharat, having thus been addressed by Arjuna, Lord Krishna drew up the fine chariot in the midst of the armies of both parties. In the presence of Bhishma, Drona, and all the other chieftains of the world, the Lord said, just behold, Partha, all the Kurus assembled here. So this is kind of a funny part, actually. Krishna is saying Just behold, part to all the Kurus assembled here. Of course, that was what, Arjuna just asked them to do, to pull the chariot up so they could see both parties, especially the opposite party, the enemies, those who were about to attack. So he's just stating the obvious. However, Krishna knows what's going to happen next. Even though Arjuna hasn't said anything, he knows what's going to happen next. And what will happen next is that Arjuna will decide that he should not fight. He's going to decide that the fight is not proper. And then he's going to give various reasons for it. And in chapter 2, Krishna is going to, point by point, disassemble all those reasons that Arjuna has for not fighting. And that's basically how the Gita will flow. So, in the presence of Bhishma, Drona, and all the other chieftains in the world, notice that Bhishma and Drona are on the opposite side. What's also odd is that Bhishma and Drona are both well-wishers of Arjuna, even though they're on the opposite side, on the enemy side. And this was discussed earlier on in the Bhagavad-gītā, that many of the generals, Bhishma, Drona, and some of the others also, actually wanted the Pandavas to win, even though they were on the other side. But because they're bound by the code of being a warrior, they have to fight for the side that they're aligned with. And as Prabhupada puts, no pains would be spared in doing the best they could to gain victory for their side, even though they really wished the other side would win. So, there, Arjuna could see within the midst of the army of both parties his fathers, grandfathers, teachers, maternal uncles, brothers, sons, grandsons, friends, and also his fathers-in-law and well-wishers. This is what makes this battle peculiar. That most of the time when soldiers engage in conflict on a battlefield, the fact is that the soldiers are usually strangers to one another. They have never met, they don't know each other's names, and that makes the idea of fighting to the death a little easier. But if you were about to engage in a battle, and all the people on the other side were your direct relatives, you knew each one of them by name, that would be a different thing. And that's exactly where Arjuna is at this moment. He is in this strange situation where he's never been in a battle before, where he's not only had to fight people he knew, but he has to fight people he respects, like Bhishma and Drona. He learned from Drona, and Bhishma was like their grandfather. He brought them up as kids, So they have a lot of affection for both of these people, yet these two are on the opposite side of the battlefield. And so Arjuna is going through a crisis. And even still, Arjuna is a very immensely wonderful devotee, and he's very dear to Krishna. And the real reason this is happening to Arjuna is so that Arjuna can create a situation where Krishna will speak Bhagavad-gītā. So normally this kind of thing wouldn't have happened to Arjuna, but if it hadn't happened to Arjuna, then Krishna would not have had the opportunity to speak Bhagavad-gītā, because it's not just for Arjuna's behalf, it's actually for all of our behalf. And so this lapse of morality, or lapse of sense of duty, is really a play by the infinite and mysterious energies of the Supreme Lord to create a situation where Arjuna would become covered over and not have the determination to fight. But he would be there with Krishna, and then Krishna would explain to him about life, about reality, about death and karma and reincarnation, and about what the spiritual path is like. So Krishna is going to explain all those things in the following chapters of Bhagavad-gītā. And this is the poignant moment where Arjuna has had his crisis. So, Krishna knows it already, even though Arjuna hasn't said it. In a minute, Arjuna will say it. So, there Arjuna could see in the midst of armies of both parties his fathers, grandfathers, teachers, maternal uncles, brothers, sons, grandsons, friends, and also his fathers-in-law and well-wishers. When the son of Kunti, Arjuna, saw all these different grades of friends and relatives, he became overwhelmed with compassion and spoke thus. So here we have a cliffhanger. You're going to have to come back next week to see what he says, because we're not going there this week, but next week we will go there, what Arjuna actually says. But as we know, in general, what will be happening is that Arjuna will be describing his reasons why he thinks the battle may not be proper. You can imagine, how would it feel like if you were supposed to attack the person who taught you how to fight, the person who brought you up. You would feel strange about it, and Arjuna certainly does. So now we're going to talk a little bit about duty. So this word duty in Sanskrit is sometimes glossed in Sanskrit as dharma. So sometimes the word dharma is translated as duty in English. Sometimes the word karma is translated as duty, or karyam. And so we have these different words that give us this concept of duty. And in the Vedic literature, this is a very strong concept, this word duty. Everyone and everything in the whole world has some class that they are qualified for. And as a result of that class, there are certain duties incumbent upon them. So we have spiritual duties and material duties. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between the two. So there is something called the Varṇāśrama system. And this is generally misinterpreted both in India and by people who study or try to assimilate the culture and values of India as the caste system, because the caste system is not really Varṇāśrama-dharma. The caste system as it's practiced in India is based almost totally on birth, and that is not Varṇāśrama-dharma. Varṇāśrama-dharma is not based on birth, it's based on guna and karma, on qualities and work. So if somebody is able to work and is inclined to work as a brahmana, and they're able to do the work of a brahmana, then they should be considered a brahmana, regardless of where they took birth or, the family or the circumstances. Similarly, if someone may have taken birth as a brahmana, but they have no qualifications, then they should not be considered a brahmana just because they took birth. But more or less, in India today, this misrepresented, totally materialistically based hierarchy is there. It's not the original system that Krishna set up, but it is degenerated into that. So everyone in the world, even if they don't consider themselves a brahmana, vaishya, kshatriya, or shudra, they have a certain psychophysical nature. They have a certain way of working, a certain way of thinking. And so as a result, they fall into one of these classes. So Varnashram exists even if nobody makes any attempt at creating Varnashram. The problem, though, is if there is no understanding or no organization behind the Varṇāśrama system. It's a system of oppression and a system of class struggle. And that's what we see in our modern world, that one class struggles against another class. The intellectuals are struggling against the military and political class. The political class is struggling against the mercantile and banking class. The banking class, and they're struggling also against the general class of people. So these classes of people are all struggling against one another instead of cooperating. So what you'll see throughout Bhagavad-gītā is this idea of attention and proper execution of one's duty. If one does their duty, then things will work out. If they don't do their duty, things will not work out. It doesn't matter if you know or you don't know your duty, you're still liable for the actions of your duty. This is the thing about the world that we live in, that whether we know what we should do or we don't know what we should do, it doesn't matter, we're still held accountable. So ignorance of the law is no excuse. And this is why many times people, as they get older, they find their lives just crumbling apart, because they have done so many things they shouldn't have done, and they have failed to do so many things that they should have done. And now, day by day, year by year, decade by decade, they've kind of worked themselves into a bad spot. So now all the repercussions of wrong activity and the repercussions of failed good activity are all starting to heap in on people. And people don't know why. Why is my life such a mess? It's because of these two things. Of course, we are really focusing on spiritual duty. If one takes very seriously spiritual duty, one can fail, and one will fail to some extent, to meet all these other responsibilities. So we have material duties, social duties, governmental duties, personal duties, bodily duties, and in Arjuna's case, he's got soldier's duty, and we have family duties. So we have all these duties. And they just get heaped upon us, and we try and struggle to meet the requirements and the necessities of these various duties. Sometimes we are able to do it, sometimes not. No one can possibly fulfill all possible duties. However, sometimes we see, as Prabhupada says, that spiritual duty and material duty are going in the same direction. But sometimes they go in opposite directions, that one has to choose between spiritual duty and material duty. And of course, if one chooses spiritual duty and fails at some aspects of material duty, that will in the long run be okay. However, if one succeeds at material duty and fails in his main execution of spiritual duty, his life will be of no value. That's why spiritual duty is absolutely the most important. Let me just pause there. I haven't really finished talking about this slide yet, but any questions about that? Okay, so spiritual duty, material duty. What is spiritual duty? Spiritual duty is simple. We have to recognize that we are actually servants of the Supreme. And as servants of the Supreme, we're in a foreign land, what we call the material world. We don't belong here, and we will never be happy here. However, we can be happier or less happy. We can never be materially happy, but we can be spiritually happy. But that is by learning our spiritual duty. Our duty is to understand that we are servants of the Supreme and to begin to act like servants of the Supreme. It's not enough just to understand that we are the servants of the Supreme. We also have to act as if we are servants of the Supreme. So that's what bhakti is. That's the language of devotion. That's the process we call bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. So the yoga of devotion means that we learn how to engage in activities that serve the Supreme. And of course, because we're in this material world, we understand in the larger picture, we have ignored the Supreme. Not just for one or two lives, but for many, many, many lifetimes we've ignored the Supreme. So naturally, we have a strong, strong tendency to ignore the Supreme, even when we want to focus on the Supreme. So it's going to be a struggle. And so the process of spiritual life is the process of gradually winning over our way of thinking, winning over our way of habits and action. Can somebody go upstairs? I don't know why they don't have somebody at the front desk. Okay, so winning over our way of action. So when we act, we begin to act almost exclusively for the Supreme, not just once in a while for the Supreme. In the beginning, it will be kind of once in a while for the Supreme. But as we continue with bhakti, we become more and more focused on the Supreme. And our thinking also tends to go towards the Supreme. We become oriented towards the Supreme, and we begin to not be so completely focused and lost in, our own material imagination of who we are and what we want to do and what we want to be. The problem with serving God or serving the Supreme is that we all have an idea of who we think we are and what we think we want to do. We have cultivated that idea for many lifetimes. And now here we are after many lifetimes of seeing ourselves as whatever it is, someone who wants to be very wealthy, someone who wants to be very powerful, someone who wants to be very attractive, someone who wants to be very popular or famous, or, there's all kinds of basic imaginations. We are not these imaginations, but in the material world, most people think themselves into a role, and then they act based on that role. This is who I am. This is what I want to do. And because we have these material ambitions, we do not focus on the Supreme. We waste our time on this imagination. Of course, whatever we build in the material world, spoiler alert, it's going to be crumbled at some point, Whatever we make, whatever we accomplish, eventually, no matter how popular, famous, or however big a mark we make on this world, we will be just a name in a long list of names, if that. Most of us won't even be a name in a long list of names. We'll just be someone who existed at one time that nobody remembers anymore because, 100 years, 200 years have passed, So that's the nature of it. But we don't see our lives from that perspective. But that's actually the future for, 90% of us. Very few people have the karma to make some dent on the material world. But even if you do, you're no longer in that body when you die. So it doesn't do you any good, You're on to another thing. It's as if you accomplish something in a dream. So this is the nature of duties. Spiritual duty means that day by day we work at changing our orientation back to the Supreme, to thinking about Krishna, acting for Krishna. We're changing our orientation. Whenever it slips in another direction, we're changing it back. And after a while, we get better at it. And as we get better at it, we feel spiritually enlivened, and we begin to connect with who we really are. And all the while, society doesn't let up and say, okay, now you can give up all your material duties. Society still demands so many things from us. So we try to keep pace with all those duties that we have, social duties, governmental duties, personal duties, bodily. Every day we wake up, we have to do so many things to keep the body from falling apart faster than it is already. We have to wash this, clean that, do this process, etc., etc. And this is duty. So the Bhagavad-gītā in all Vedic literature is very strong on dharma and on karyam, on actions and duties. So if someone performs them properly, they will be happy. And if there's a society of people who are performing them properly, then that society will be functional. But if a society is ignoring their basic duties for the class of person that they are, or if the individual is ignoring his or her own duties for who he or she is, then that society will be very hollow, very turbulent, and that person will feel adrift in a world that makes no sense. So, any questions about that?
What's the number
Just a second.
7? What's the number 7 of duty?
7? Oh, shirking duties.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So shirking duties. That means to not perform. That's what Arjuna is about to do. He's going to say that, my dear Krishna, I think this battle is immoral, and what I should do is just meditate. And if they find me while I'm meditating and they kill me, so much, that's okay too. I'm not going to fight. That's what Arjuna is suggesting. So he's shirking his duty when somebody gives up the duty that they're supposed to have. Now, I can briefly mention, because in this section, in the purport, Prabhupada talks about the duty of God to his devotees. So as we have duties to society, as we have duties to the Vedas, we have also duties to the Supreme Lord. Now, it might seem strange that the Supreme Lord also has duties to us. So in other words, the Supreme Lord, whenever someone is trying their best to follow proper duties, then the Supreme Lord will reciprocate with them. So here, Krishna is feeling for Arjuna, and he has the desire to bring Arjuna out of his mental confusion. Any questions before we move to that side? Okay. So now I wanted to talk about, because this is an important concept, we will again talk about these things, but I call these the 3 most misunderstood words in the English language. Love, freedom, and happiness. Everybody thinks they know what these words mean. But if you ask some very simple questions about these words, it will immediately be obvious that these words are more mysterious than they appear. So let's start with love. We talked a little bit about love a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the idea of free will. So if there was no such thing as free will, then there could be no love, because love is predicated, or love is based on the concept of free will. If I can love you or not love you, then love has a meaning. If I'm forced to love you or I can't love you, then love means nothing. So love is also, as most people think of it, a stative adjective. Most people think that love is like an emotional condition that our mind and heart are in. That's the way most people think of it. But the Vedas really don't think of it that way. Love, according to the Vedas, is more of a transitive verb where it entails action for the sake of another. Action that actually understands the needs and the desires of another and tries to fulfill them at all costs. That's what love is. So that's why we talk about love of God, understanding the needs and desires of God and the effort to try to fulfill them at all costs. So again, in our modern world, mostly we think of love as a emotion or a feeling that we're in. You know, we feel a certain thing when we're around a particular individual, and that's what we call love. But that's not love from the Vedic perspective. The Vedic perspective understands love as a transitive verb that we are acting for the sake of someone else. So I just wanted to focus on that one. So that's love. Any question about that one? Okay. So next we'll move on to freedom, which is also another misunderstood word in the English language. There's nobody up there at the front desk? Oh my God. So freedom means that we are able to do or not do. Rather, actually, freedom means one thing. Freedom means that we are able to want anything that we want. It doesn't mean we can have anything that we want, but we're free to target our desires on anything. It can be good for us or bad for us. It can be reasonable or unreasonable. It can be easily attainable or completely unobtainable. It can be good for other people or bad for other people, but we can target our hearts on anything. That's what we have freedom for. So we have absolute freedom on that level. We don't have freedom on the level of being able to do anything and everything, or to have anything and everything. If we want to just have anything and everything, and we just go simply claiming something, we'll be arrested for theft, you know. So it doesn't work like that. Freedom, nobody has the kind of freedom that the Supreme Lord has. The Supreme Lord can have anything he wants at any time, and he doesn't even have to work for it. Whatever he wants automatically is automatically generated. He doesn't even have to think about it. His energy is generated. So with such a person, what does such a person need? And such a person as the Supreme Lord doesn't need anything. He doesn't need anything from us. He could make everything right in this world in a single second if he wanted to. But that's not the purpose of this world. He rather gives us the opportunity to try to act in this world to please him. Now, in the spiritual world, people are also doing that very self-same thing. They are acting in the spiritual world in order to please him. But in the spiritual world, there are no negative actors. There are no people who are actually trying to reject the Supreme or to act against the interests of the Supreme. But in the material world, there are people who are trying to reject the Supreme and act against the interests of the Supreme. So in this world we have that, but in the spiritual world, no. So we can desire anything we want, but we can't necessarily generate or acquire everything we want. Usually, material desires and their fulfillment are based on our past karma. People with a lot of past good karma are able to put their minds to a particular desire and actually bring that desire to pass. People with bad karma put their minds to desires and those things don't happen. Worse yet, Sometimes, if they have bad enough karma, the material world gives them the opposite of what they want. And this is what bad karma is about. So, the Supreme Lord, Krishna, has absolute freedom. We have a very limited freedom of desire. We can desire anything we want. Now, if we have the right kind of karma, we can sometimes actualize whatever our desires are. If we have the wrong kind of karma, well, we won't. So now I'm going to topic 3, happiness. Another very misunderstood word. I'm focusing on these 3 because as we move through the Bhagavad-gītā, we'll start to see that we need to retrain our thinking for understanding what we really mean by the word love, what we really mean by the word freedom, what we really mean by the word happiness. Because if we don't, Gita is very confusing because these words pop up. You know, they pop up in modern talk, modern speaking, but they also pop up in the Bhagavad-gītā in all kinds of places. And so we have to understand what they really mean, you know. Love doesn't mean that now I have got a romantic, emotional rush from being next to someone. That's not what we consider love. Love means learning how to act in the best interests of the Supreme, or for that matter, in the best interests of anyone, and doing things for them. Freedom, again, doesn't mean that we can do anything and everything. You have 2 kinds of freedom, basically. You can be free from restrictions. In other words, we were talking about a lot of rules and regulations in the Vedas. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. You should move towards this kind of an action, this kind of a way of living, and away from that kind of way of living. You can forget about all that. So you can be free from restrictions, but then you won't be free from karma. And karma will start pounding you with various slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. However, if you choose not to be free from restrictions, you choose to try to follow the restrictions of the world of duty and of bhakti, then you'll find that you'll have the freedom from these constant deluges of bad karma, because then bad karma will not be happening to you all the time. So, now happiness is a simple word, but most people think happiness means material happiness. So to them, happiness means here I have a sense, like my eye or ear, nose, skin, or whatever it is. Here I have a sense object, and the 2 go. So when sense object meets the senses, and that sense object is favorable in our list of things that we like, then we experience what most people call happiness. But it's very shallow, and it's also fleeting, you know. If you eat something that you really like, okay, how long can that last? Maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then the meal's finally over and you're on to something else. You can watch a television program or something, and how long will that last? Maybe an hour, if it's maybe a little bit longer than that. So that's a very intermittent and also very low level of happiness. But spiritual happiness is deeper than that. It's about fulfillment, and it's about connecting with the Supreme. So it's a very deep version of happiness, more like fulfillment. All right. So, any final questions about any of that? Because we've...
I missed the point of happiness. I will heard it. No, I will heard it later.
Okay. So these are the concepts that I wanted to talk about today. So we've done now chapter 3. We've discussed Arjuna seeing the armies. We are going to find out about his decision not to fight. We talked about duty, love, freedom, and happiness. So I wanted to talk about that. And then next week we'll finish up chapter 1. We'll do verses 28 to 46. And we're going to find out what Arjuna's reaction actually is to seeing the soldiers on the other side, his reasons not to fight. And we're going to talk a little bit about the perception that we have of reality and how reality gets created. And then I'll do a little recap of chapter 1. So that, and some of the basic concepts we have. That's what we'll do next week on 412. So, thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavad-gītā. Hare Krishna. Well, before I forget it, let me do my clap.